Welcome to this second part of this four-part presentation on regulatory benchmarking. In this relatively short part, I want to illustrate some of the challenges of doing a large international benchmarking study, and I'm departing from one we did in 2008 for the European Council of Energy Regulators. We've done it before on before that at a smaller scale with fewer transmission companies, and later we've done it twice also with even more transmission companies. But the challenge here is that most countries only have one or a few. In the case of Germany, and that time they had four. So they have only very few transmission companies. So you really need to do an international benchmarking to compare them. And that, of course, creates additional difficulties and make it necessary to really work a lot with data standardization. So I want to illustrate some of that in this short presentation. The first challenge is that the different companies in the different countries, in this case, do not necessarily do the same things. So transmission services can be split in, for example, be split in 6 different kind of activities. One is to be a market facilitator, another is to be a system operator. The third thing is to do grid planning. You can also be grid constructor, you can do grid maintenance, and you can be the owner or the leaser of the grid. And in the different countries, the transmission companies have different combination of those activities. So we needed to decide at an early point which part do we really want to benchmark. And so we looked at the previous one was only looking at grid construction and grid maintenance. In this one, we wanted to extend it a little bit to include also grid planning. But it means that we have to get rid of the cost associated with some of the other activities that some of the companies have, and which are not part of some of the other TSO's activity set. So that's defining the scope of the benchmarking is always very important. And in many cases, the companies you want to compare do not do exactly the same kind of activities. So scope definition is one issue, and that creates another issue, namely to allocate the cost of the total cost of the company on these different activities, which are in scope and those that are outside of the scope. And what you see here is that in particularly the allocation of central management costs, the board of directors, the CEO, and then the joint staff cost and expenses, sort of joint cost in general, they have to be allocated on these different activities. Some of the costs have to be allocated on the activities which is outside the benchmarking scope, and some of these indirect costs have to be allocated on the four scopes, the four activities that we had in scope in our case here, namely planning, construction, and maintenance of the network. Then that's the first thing, and then you have to start standardizing the cost further. If you look at operating expenses, we have the in-scope and out-scope issue here at the very beginning. And to make sure that people don't just remove a lot of cost from the analysis, we will typically ask the out-of-scope cost share to be audited. But then different firms may face different salary levels, so you want to correct for that. There might be, if you have several years of data, there might be differences in the inflation rates. These countries operate with different currencies. You have to correct for that also. So you need to do a lot of corrections in order to get comparable costs just on the Opex side. And on the Capex side, or the capital cost, it's even more demanding, because if you just look at accounting data, the capital cost will depend a lot on how the companies have depreciated their assets, and that the depreciation pattern and the depreciation speed may vary a lot from one country to another, one company to another. So to make it really comparable, you want to standardize this depreciation pattern. And the way we did that was that we wanted to use we want to depreciate the asset as a constant annuities, because once you have installed a network, the value you get out of the use of that is more or less constant for a long period of time. So it's not necessarily like a linear depreciation that makes sense. So we collected investment data for these networks 30, 40 years back in time, and then we standardized the depreciation pattern to get constant annuities of the services provided by those by those assets. And that again meant that we had to do a lot of inflation corrections and currency conversions, because also in this set of data we also had a change from one currency to another in the different countries when at some point a lot of them started using euros. So there's a lot of issues here, and actually the results can be very dependent on how you standardize the cost items, especially inflation corrections can play a big role here in a study like this, where you have several decades of data involved. So that's it. That's the general idea. And then the structure in this project was that the transmission companies were supplying data to the national regulators, and then the national regulators gave the data to this group, this E3 group, E3 grid consultancy group that did the analysis. And then we could figure out what is the incompetent efficiency and what is potentially the frontier shift in the transmission business. And we could publicize that in an anonymized version in an open report, but then we can also give more detailed information to individual transmission companies and also to groups of transmission companies that opt to share their information internally so that they could actually learn from each other. So you can imagine that it requires a lot of confidentiality agreements, a lot of legal work to make this whole data flow work when you have some 20 different companies supplying data in some, I don't remember exactly, but probably like 16 or 17 different countries. So the data collection really have to be well organized for a benchmarking project to work properly in many cases. And in this project, we used the different data calls. We had one call for focusing on cost data, another one focusing on the assets and very detailed assets. So we identify more than 1,000 different assets in a network. Then there was also a call for operating specific conditions, things that individual operators thought was particularly complicated for their operations compared to other countries, companies. And so we collected a lot of sort of data like that. We also asked data directly from the NRAs, the National Regulatory Authorities, about some output indicators, quality indicators we got from SEERS. And we also asked for financial accounts and stuff like that, auditing statements. That was, in this project, it was organized so that a lot of that was supplied by the NRAs. So just to give you one example about these set calls, the operator-specific conditions. So every company would like to claim that they have special challenges that should allow them to have some extra cost involved. So one really need a standardized way to deal with those operator-specific conditions or claims of such conditions. So the question is really if a company points out some operating condition that they are facing and which might not be faced by others, we have to decide whether that leads to an eligible cost increase, or we can remove some of the cost based on these special conditions. So we kind of used three conditions in this study. We asked, is it significant? So we don't want to struggle a lot and spend months of working with a small number of small cost items. It also needed to be something which is exogenous to the company, something that they can, that's forced upon them, that they cannot directly impact themselves. So, for example, one example could be that in some countries you are forced to paint the towers in a certain color, and that might come with an extra cost. And if that's part of the legal framework, then they should be allowed to remove those costs of painting the towers from the cost basis. And then we also wanted to check whether the claimed extraordinary conditions, or these conditions was really extraordinary, or whether they were of a more stationary character, because it must be something that they face year after year. If it's just like an accident or something like that, then that's kind of the normal operation, that you might run into accidents, and then you should cover that via insurance. So we had these three criteria, and if they all were, there seems to be a good argument for these extraordinary costs, then we would also ask the national regulatory authorities to endorse the statements. And then based on that, we could decide to either include them as some extra outputs or some extra conditional conditions, or we would just adjust the cost levels used. So this sort of gives you an impression about all the works that goes into just establishing the data that you want to use in a benchmarking study. A lot of benchmarking studies will take maybe 1.5 years to set up all the legal work, to set up all the data collection, and then once you have all the data, and once all the data is verified and clean and everything, then you can start to do your model analysis. So actually, the thing we focus on in a benchmarking course is typically just a small part of this whole benchmarking process. But I'll say a little bit more about this whole process in the third part of this presentation. This we keep short, relatively short, and so this is the end of this, the third part, the second part of the presentation. So it's time for some questions.